It's a Tuesday evening. It wasn't a particularly terrible day. Nothing dramatic happened, no single event you could point to and say, that's why. You just feel a little hollow, a little heavy. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a name, but you know it immediately when it arrives. So you pick up your phone, you open a store. Not because you need anything, not because there's something specific you've been looking for. You just start scrolling. A candle goes in the cart. A book you may or may not read. A small ceramic mug in a color you already have. You don't check out, or maybe you do. Either way, when you put the phone down, something has shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Most people call this retail therapy. A bit of a joke. A harmless little indulgence. Or, depending on who's watching, a sign that something is wrong. But psychologists who study emotional regulation and consumer behavior have spent years measuring exactly what you just did, and what they found is not what anyone expected. Retail therapy is not a joke. It's not a weakness. Let's start with the standard explanation, because it's the one most people have heard. You buy things when you're sad because it provides a temporary distraction, a brief hit of dopamine, a short circuit around the feeling you don't want to feel. And then the feeling comes back, often accompanied by guilt about the purchase. Weak, impulsive, avoidant. That's the narrative. But here is what that explanation misses. If shopping when sad were purely avoidance, a distraction, to escape an uncomfortable feeling, then it wouldn't matter what you bought. Any distraction would work, equally well. A TV show, a walk, a phone call, but that's not how it works. The research shows that people in sad states do not buy randomly. They buy in patterns, specific categories, specific types of objects. Things that share a quality that has nothing to do with distraction, which means something more specific is happening. And understanding what it is changes everything about how you think. About that Tuesday evening on your sofa. In 2011, two researchers, Salen Adelaide and Margaret Malloy, published a paper that reframed retail therapy from a pop psychology cliché into a measurable, psychological mechanism. They called it a strategic effort to improve mood, not a weakness. Not avoidance, a strategy. Here is what they found. Participants who were induced into a sad state and then allowed to browse and select items without any obligation to buy reported significantly improved mood afterward, 79% of them. But then the researchers did something more precise. They tried to isolate what was doing the work. Was it the browsing? Was it the distraction of looking at products? Was it the object itself once purchased? None of these. The mechanism was the act of choosing, making a decision, exercising agency over something, even something small, even something entirely unnecessary, restored the participant's sense of personal control. And it was that restoration of control that produced the mood improvement. Not the candle, not the book, not the mug. The act of deciding. You were never buying the object. You were buying the feeling of being in charge of something. But here is where it gets really interesting, because it is not just any negative emotion that produces this pattern. A research team led by Jennifer Lerner at Harvard ran a series of studies on emotion and economic decision-making. They compared people in different emotional states, sad, disgusted, neutral, and anxious. And what they found was specific in a way that no one had predicted. Sadness, and only sadness. Significantly increased willingness to spend money and to acquire new objects. Not disgust, not anxiety, not general negativity, specifically sadness. The researchers traced the mechanism to something precise. Sadness is the emotion most associated with the perception that your current situation is not the one you want to be in. In other words, sadness signals a state you want to change, and the brain responds to that signal by increasing motivation to act, to change something, anything. Acquiring something new is one of the fastest signals the brain can send itself that the situation has changed, that you are no longer in exactly the place you were, even if only slightly, even if only by owning one. New object in a slightly different world than the one you were in. There is a concept in developmental psychology introduced by the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott in 1953. He called it the transitional object. The idea is this. When a child is very young and feels distressed, when the world feels too large and uncertain, they reach for a specific object, a stuffed animal, a blanket, a particular toy. Not because the object resolves the distress, but because holding it provides a sense of continuity, a sense that something is stable when everything else feels like it might not be. Winnicott observed that this is not a sign of dependency, it is a sign of developing emotional intelligence. The child is using an object to regulate a feeling it doesn't yet have words for. Now consider what the adult does on a difficult Tuesday evening. She picks up her phone. She opens a store. She adds a candle to a cart. The mechanism is the same. The scale is different. The vocabulary is different. But the function, using an object to anchor yourself when the world feels uncertain, is identical. And it goes further back than childhood. Archaeologists have found grave goods in burial sites across every continent and every era of human history. Objects placed with the dead, tools, jewelry, food, weapons, objects were considered so important to emotional and spiritual continuity that humans placed them in the ground alongside their most beloved dead. We have been using objects to manage the unbearable feelings of being human for as long as we have been human. Now here is the part that almost nobody talks about, because it changes the entire moral frame around retail therapy. In a follow-up study, Adelaide and Meloy took the same setup: sad participants, shopping, mood improvement, and added one element. After the shopping, they induced guilt about the purchases. They reminded participants of their budget. They had them think about whether the purchase was responsible. They activated the internal critic. And the mood improvement disappeared. Not just disappeared, reversed. Participants who felt guilty about their retail therapy ended up in a worse mood than before the shopping had occurred. How is that possible? Because the shopping was working, the control restoration was genuine, the mechanism was functioning exactly as it should. And then the guilt, the "you shouldn't have done that" voice, took the control back. You had briefly been in charge of something. And then shame told you that you weren't, that you had made a mistake, that you should have known better. The behavior was adaptive. The shame response was the problem. In a separate study at Carnegie Mellon, researchers found that people who made purchase decisions, not just browsed but actually decided, reduced their residual sadness by 40% compared to a control group. 40%. From buying a small object they did not strictly need. The problem was never the shopping. The problem was everything we told ourselves about it afterward. There is one distinction worth making clearly, because it separates what research shows works from what research shows creates a longer problem. Retail therapy, in the precise, documented sense, is effective as emotional regulation when it involves genuine decision-making over a small, bounded choice, one item, something you can afford without meaningful consequence, a choice that exercises agency without creating new sources of stress. The control restoration mechanism works because you regained something. You chose. You decided. Something shifted. Where it stops working, and where the research is equally clear, is when the scale of the purchase creates a new stressor, when the credit card bill becomes the new source of sadness, when the financial anxiety replaces the original feeling and adds another layer on top of it. This is not a moral judgment, it is a practical one. The mechanism that makes retail therapy work is control restoration. Anything that reduces your sense of control afterward, financial, stress, regret, guilt, directly undermines the mechanism. The candle that costs $12 and gives you a moment of genuine agency is not the same behavior as the $300 impulse you will quietly dread for weeks. One of them works. The other is borrowing from future you to pay for the feeling present you needs. So the next time you find yourself on a quiet evening, phone in hand, adding something to a cart you didn't plan to open, remember what is actually happening. You are not being weak. You are not avoiding your feelings. You are not doing something that needs to be corrected or explained away. You are doing what humans have done for as long as there have been objects to reach for. You are using a small, bounded act of choice to restore a sense of agency in a moment when the world feels like it's happening to you rather than with you. The candle is not the point. The book is not the point. The small ceramic mug in a color you already have is not the point. The point is that you chose something in a moment when very little felt choosable. And the research is clear that choice matters. It does something real, something measurable, something that has been working in The human brain, since long before there were online stores to scroll through. You were never buying the object. You were buying back a feeling of control. And that was exactly what you needed. If this changed how you think about that quiet evening on the sofa, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Tell us, do you have a go-to when you need to feel like you're back in control of something? Doesn't have to be shopping, could be anything. We're genuinely curious because the next video is about something that happens every November and most people understand intellectually but cannot seem to stop anyway. We're going to look at why sales and promotions make you spend more money, not less, and why the part of your brain that believes it's saving is the exact same part that's driving you further in.